our guests in Europe and also elsewhere around the world, and welcome to the official launch of the China in the broader Black Sea region report, an endeavor led by GLOBSEC together with Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies and the Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation. My name is Kackzmarski. I'm the head of GLOBSEC Brussels office and the coordinator of this report. And I am joined today by three of the authors, whom I will introduce momentarily. Today's launch of the report is just the first step in better understanding China, the Chinese foreign and security policy objectives in the broader Black Sea region, as well as the implications for both the EU decision makers and those living and deciding on the other side of the pond. As we all know, the broader Black Sea region is the scene of increasing tensions amid renewed great power competition and conflicting both geopolitical and geo-economic interests. So the rise of China and its solidifying regional footprint requires a better understanding at the policy level, at the political and policy level, of how this influence is capitalized at national and regional level, what type of challenges it creates for respective countries, and what choices the decision makers have at their disposal in this new complex and complicated geopolitical setting. The report is structured in 5 parts, with 5 external contributions tackling the broader Belt and Road Initiative, the Sino-Russian relationship, the Sino-Turkish relationship, China-Western Balkans, and the interplay between geopolitics and geoeconomics. We try to look at multiple levels of analysis with the aim to identify inflection points and missing links in these relationships in order to foster a public debate that would not only, for example, look at the 17+1 format, which is a bit of a business as usual, but also looking at how CE countries are not or should no longer being seen as a Trojan horse, and zoom out and understand the particular characteristics of the regional dynamic and competitive environment. Today, I'm joined by Marcin Kackzmarski, lecturer in security studies at the University of Glasgow, where he focuses his research on the Russia-China relations. Dimitar, Lilkov, research officer with the Martens Center, where he focuses on EU decision-making, and Tena, Prelec, a research fellow at the University of Oxford and research associate at the London School of Economics, where she focuses on Southeast Europe. We will start with presentation of findings and conclusions by each author for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will move directly into follow-up and questions and answers. So please use the Q&A function if you want to raise questions for the speakers, and try to be brief, and also try to address your question to a specific speaker or another. We are on record, live streaming this webinar across multiple social media channels, and towards the end, I will also share in the chat the link where the report is already up for grabs on our website. We are together for about 75 minutes. So please benefit the most out of it and ask all the questions that you are still looking for answers. And now, without further ado, I will start with you, Dimitar, because you have been analyzing the Belt and Road Initiative in the region. So what are your key findings and points of analysis that we should be aware of beyond the large amount of noise surrounding the BRI and the 17+1 format?
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Warm welcome to our online audience. Huge thanks for GLOBSEC for setting up this publication, and I'm really humbled to be part of this great setup and authors as well. I hope you can see my presentation right now. Just give me a thumbs up if all is fine. I'll be focused on the BRI in the Black Sea region. Hopefully, I'll be on time. So quickly, what is the Belt and Road Initiative, or the so-called Chinese project of the century? Officially announced by President Xi Jinping as the biggest project for the next 100 years for China, it aims to revive ancient trade routes and make sure that China helps in rebuilding infrastructure, in boosting trade and improving trade relationships with developing countries and also in the West. This should be seen as an initiative driven by politics and geography as well, because China sees a huge opportunity to invest, especially in the developing world, when it comes to heavy infrastructure, telecoms, even ports, and make sure that more and more trade links lead to Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative usually is described as a geopolitical tool, but we shouldn't underestimate its importance for the internal economic life of China. Economic policy, Chinese economic policy is linked with exports. So if China wants to remain one of the biggest manufacturing champions in the next couple of decades, it needs to make sure that it diversifies its trade links and its investments globally. So the BRI is important for its soft power throughout the globe and also for its own economic development and its manufacturing strategy. Now, talking about the BRI in media and many discussions like these ones, usually analysts see it as something which leads to hidden debts and lots of hidden caveats. And I mean, this is true because in certain countries we've seen in the past that the BRI projects have been linked with political favors or huge amounts of public debt, which are unsustainable in the next couple of years to be paid by the respective country. But we must bear in mind that the Belt and Road Initiative is a shapeshifter. We cannot say that it is this or that. We cannot really see it as something which acts in a unified manner globally. It really depends on which continent, which country the BRI is pursuing its objective. That's why I'm describing it as a shapeshifter, because it really depends on local context and it really depends on the bilateral political relationship of Beijing and the respective country. So without further ado, let's zoom in on the Black Sea region and especially European member states when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, why is the BRI tempted to focus in Europe or engage with Bulgaria or Romania? Well, if you want to revive ancient trade routes and the ancient Silk Roads, you need to be linked with the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, of course, given geography. And especially if you manage, from China's perspective, if you manage to involve European countries, even in Central and Eastern Europe, this means that you're penetrating European markets. This means that your projects potentially are abiding by public procurement rules or environmental or labor standards, which means that China can announce to the world that BRI complies with European standards. Now, focusing on Bulgaria and Romania, the interaction between the BRI and Bulgaria and Romania is fully linked with the so-called 17+1 mechanism, which is a huge topic on its own right. Maybe we can devote some time in the discussion for it. But very briefly, the 17+1 mechanism was announced after the financial crisis. And this is the key investment mechanism of China, with which it interacts with Central and Eastern European countries, also 5 Balkan countries and the Baltics. The 17+1 mechanism has been related with lots of promises from China, and that there's been lots of talk about investment in huge infrastructure projects. But in the last couple of years, we saw that many Central and Eastern European countries are getting more and more disappointed because the promised investment sums never came and many of the ambitious projects were never realized, especially when it comes to European member states, because China is mostly interested in the Balkan countries under the 17+1 initiative. The same goes for Bulgaria and Romania. In its interaction with China in the last decade, both countries have been haunted by rising debt levels and trade imbalances. For example, the trade deficit of Romania to China in 2019 was 4 billion euros, the biggest trade deficit in the region. So both countries are not very optimistic lately when it comes to the BRI, but when it comes to trade and investment with China. When it comes to Beijing, Chinese appetite is especially focused on energy projects and maritime infrastructure, especially in Bulgaria, the port of Varna, expanding the BRI maritime route to the Black Sea in Varna, and also investing in the Chernavoda nuclear power plant in Romania, which last year, unexpectedly, Romania decided to scrape and give the contracts to US and French firms. So as you see in the last couple of years, the big ambitions from BRI in Bulgaria and Romania, as I focus in more detail in the report, have gone colder, especially when we talk about technology. Both Bulgaria and Romania decided to join the Clean Network Initiative of the United States, which promotes protecting citizen privacy and sensitive user data. And under this initiative, the signatories decide to keep companies like Huawei or ZTE out of their networks, which was a big hit on China's digital ambitions to penetrate when it comes to 5G networks or expanding their digital footprint in Central and Eastern Europe. So bottom line, 2021, the disappointment with the 17+1 initiative, the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and also the fact that we have growing pressure from the US to oppose Chinese initiatives. Going to non-EU countries, engagement with Georgia and Ukraine. I've bundled them because there's a couple of interesting similarities. Belt and Road Initiative in Georgia and Ukraine is seen as a leverage against Russia. Because economically engaging with China and boosting diplomatic relationship with China for both Georgia and Ukraine means that China might diplomatically serve as a helping hand in preserving both countries' territorial integrity, especially given the rough history in the last couple of years and the confrontation with Russia. Both countries, Georgia and Ukraine, are in a way hedging their bets when it comes to the BRI, because they're on the one hand interacting with the European Union, which is their biggest trade partner. They have agreements for free trade and enhanced cooperation, but they're also interested in public investment and boosted trade with China. So they're trying to play both sides. But in the last several years, especially Georgia, which signed a free trade agreement with China, has also been disappointed by its trade prospects. In the last 2 years, Georgia saw declining trade exports to China. Even its export of wine fell, which is quite telling. How am I with time, Alexandra? 3 more minutes, thank you. The big positive for both Ukraine and Georgia when it comes to Belt and Road Initiative is that China offers quick cash with very little conditionality, because the experience lately of both countries in interacting with the European Union when it comes to, let's say, loans or EBRD support or macroeconomic financial flows, European money usually comes with conditionality. Conduct specific reforms, make sure your judiciary works well, and China offers less requirements and is more and more flexible when it comes to providing loans. So this is why China is seen as an interesting partner, Georgia and Ukraine. Turkey and Russia, I think I have 2 more minutes. Very quickly, Turkey is optimistic when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, especially for boosting its rail connectivity. There's been numerous projects for enhanced infrastructure through Eurasia. And also given the economic crisis and the depreciating lira and the growing deficit of Turkey, it's more and more optimistic towards warmer economic relationships with China. The biggest problem for Turkey when it comes to the BRI and Beijing is, of course, the problem in Xinjiang and the fact that China is keeping more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in concentration camps. Russia, BRI is seen with certain kind of disapproval in a way, because even though Russia needs economic investment and better infrastructure, it has its own interests in promoting its own vision for Eurasian Union, and is a bit lukewarm in seeing China gaining so much strength in Eurasia. Final slide, key observations and takeaways. Of course, all of these things I highlight are explored in more detail in the report, but a couple of very brief takeaways. We see in the broader Black Sea region that the Belt and Road Initiative is heavily focused on road, railway, and maritime infrastructure, also energy. We do not see the digital Silk Road penetrating our region. The digital Silk Road is a part of the BRI, which aims to improve telecom infrastructure, underwater sea cables, fiber optics, data centers. This is something which is very heavily developed in Asia and also in North Africa. but we see less and less digital projects in the Belt and Road Initiative. Also maybe tied to the fact that the EU countries decided to join the US Clean Act initiative, as I mentioned. Bulgaria and Romania are in an interesting position right now when it comes to BRI because of calls from Brussels to make sure that there's European unity when it comes to BRI and that environmental labor standards are preserved. So Bulgaria and Romania find themselves, when communicating with China right now, as two countries which need to represent Western values and rules when it comes to BRI. I've already mentioned the disappointment with the 17+1 initiative. 2020 has been really odd for Central and Eastern Europe and China. More and more countries are becoming disappointed with the rising trade deficits towards China, and there is a palpable need for reforming the mechanism. So I think that in the next couple of years, we'll see more and more Central and Eastern European countries either abstaining from participation or making sure that the relationship is improved with China. When it comes to non-EU countries, the EU should make sure that our backyard, our Eastern European Eastern Partnership is preserved, and the EU's role when it comes to providing loans, funding, and overall assistance to the countries like Georgia and Ukraine is preserved, so as that the EU makes sure that its footprint and its partnerships in Eurasia are well maintained. Very interestingly, and I'm closing here, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of COVID-19. This made public perception more and more negative in many European countries when it comes to China. And also the US-China tech and trade rivalry will also apply pressure to European capitals and the Black Sea region countries when they are communicating and partnering with Beijing. Lastly, we shouldn't underestimate the danger ahead. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, because of the specificities of the Black Sea region, we will see rising public debt, low level of public investment, which will mean that these countries will find themselves in a difficult position and applying for BRI projects, even though maybe potentially frowned upon from Washington and Brussels. These projects provide money, provide employment opportunities. So the Black Sea countries should be cognizant of this, and I look forward to the other contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitar. Indeed, some interesting findings in the report. I encourage everyone to go through the chapters. And now I'm moving to the China-Russia relationship and invite Marcin to take over. Also, Dimitar started a bit of conversation. And this relationship seems to be causing a lot of waves and fears, both in Europe, but also across the Atlantic. So Marcin, are these fears about the Russia-China relationship legit? Is this a relationship which is a growing threat to the Western liberal order, has the potential to be a spoiler of the international system? How the asymmetry is seen on both sides? So some of your findings will be very relevant for the conversation.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to the report and to this event. There are quite a lot of questions that you ask, and I will try to address them in this short time frame. So this report provided me with an opportunity to look into the Russian-Chinese relationship in the Black Sea region, and in the most important I would like to start with is that this relationship is relatively low profile in the region, and the relevance of the Black Sea region, broader Black Sea region for Russia and China is limited. To some extent, the relationship between Moscow and Beijing in the Black Sea region resembles the relationship in other regions such as Central Europe, Africa, or Latin America. So in brief, we see a number of activities which are parallel, and which each of these activities pose a challenge to the West. But as far as we can tell, they are rarely coordinated, and they are pursued independently by both states rather than in tandem. So certainly, what we certainly see in the region is not an alliance. It is not an alliance relationship, and one of the big problems for the relationship in general, or one of the biggest obstacles to this relationship becoming an alliance, actually lies in the region, because it's how China approaches Russia's aggressive projects and Russia's aggressive actions. So whereas China refrained and exercised patience with regard to Russia's policy towards Georgia and Ukraine, Beijing does not recognize the annexation of Crimea. Beijing did not recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and in fact, following these policies of Russia, they join opposition towards separatism, which we could see in the 2000s, is no longer one of the building blocks of the relationship. Second point that I'd like to emphasize, it's the asymmetry in how both powers see the Black Sea region. For Russia, it is of utmost importance. For China, it is of growing but still secondary importance. Also in the context of the BRI. So from the Russian perspective, especially after 2014, we see that the region is looked at on the one hand as a militarized frontier, and the actions that we have seen, including the strengthening of Russian forces in the Crimean Peninsula, the attempts to make an Azov Sea into the kind of Russian lake. These factors, along with growing tensions with the US in the Black Sea, illustrate the relevance of the Black Sea region for Russia and for its security and defense policy. From the Chinese perspective, the importance of the region, of course, has increased along with the BRI, but we need to remember that when we speak about transit corridors between China and the European Union, the Sea corridor, so the one going through Turkey, especially going through Turkey or going through the Black Sea as such, is still of secondary importance. It's too expensive. It requires intermodal transport, so China needs to change from train to sea lanes to trains again. Whereas Ukraine might be and is an important part of the transit corridor. It is the transit corridor that goes from China via Ukraine, is the one between 2014 and 2019. This transit corridor was practically closed for China, and only when Russia lifted the ban for transit of goods which were previously transited via Ukraine to China, this part of the transit corridor gained on importance. So from the perspective of China, of course, we need to remember that Ukraine plays a specific role given the Ukrainian military industry, but there comes the factor which Dimitar already mentioned, so the US factor, and the fact that we have seen strong US efforts to prevent Chinese companies from taking over the Motor Sich Ukrainian arms company, which means that from the Chinese perspective, the presence in Ukraine is going to face, especially those aspects which are related to security and defense, are going to be more and more difficult. For Russia, we also need to remember about the role of the Black Sea region as a transit corridor. Following the failures of South Stream, Russia still managed to construct the Turk Stream. So to sum up, I would say that what we see in the region is very limited coordination. It's rather the parallel presence of both states, which constitutes certainly the challenge to the West, but these are rather two challenges that should be dealt with on a parallel basis rather than treated as a kind of joint Sino-Russian effort that's not present, that we don't see in the region. What are the prospects for change, or what are the possible scenarios? I would say that the rivalry in the region is the plausibility of the rivalry between Russia and China in the region is rather limited. As one reason is that both states tread really carefully when it comes to their mutual interests. And one might say that if they have managed to reconcile their interests in Central Asia, it is going to be much easier to reconcile those interests in the Black Sea region. Secondly, those areas which I identified in the report as areas of possible competition, like, for instance, civilian nuclear industry. As Dimitar mentioned, Romania decided to resign to give up the ideas of a Chinese company building the nuclear power plant, which means that if we look at other states, we can probably see that a similar pattern with certain unwillingness, sometimes under the US pressure, to accept Chinese or Russian projects. At the same time, I would say that the potential for alliance is still limited, and also due to the reason I started with, so China's unwillingness to fully support Russia's aggressive policies. What we can certainly watch this year more carefully is the Russian strategic exercises Zapad 21. The questions are the Chinese troops going to participate? Is it going to be, to some extent, a symbolic gesture? For the last 3 editions of Russia's big strategic exercises, the Chinese troops always were invited. Their presence in the Zapad exercises, I would argue, would constitute certain signal to the region. But probably a stronger signal would be the presence of the Chinese Navy ships in the Black Sea within the framework of the Joint Sea exercises. But while we have seen while we watched the Chinese presence in the Baltic Sea or in the Mediterranean, China still, I would speculate, trying not to send the signal that it supports the policy towards Ukraine, or Russia's policy towards Ukraine. So I would probably expect growing some kind of reconciliation of interests, like Russia's lifting ban on transit corridor via Ukraine. We don't know whether this decision was influenced by the Chinese side, or whether it was just a pressure from domestic players such as Russian railways, but nonetheless, Russia reconsidered its policy towards Ukraine with China in mind. And I would argue that Chinese leaders are following similar lines, so they take into consideration Russia's interests, even if they don't necessarily coordinate their actions with Russia. So I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Marcin. So rivalry is limited, potential for alliance is limited, but we need to look at the signals that would show us that this relationship is going towards a direction that might cause additional waves or fears. We already have quite some questions in both the chat and the Q&A section. But before that, I do want to have Tena presenting the China-Western Balkans relationship, because I think that within the 17+1, Western Balkans has a special place, both in terms of a level of investment, but also in the heart of at least some of the leaders. For example, like President of Serbia, Vučić, who probably is the biggest supporter in the region of President Xi. So infrastructure projects are rolling out, yet at a slower pace. There are some promises that were kept, but what is the reality on the ground, and how is this relationship also impacting the prospects of European integration of the Western Balkans?
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to the whole GLOBSEC team and to my wonderful co-panelists for their excellent presentations. So my report starts with the words stronger, faster, better, which seem to encapsulate in a way or the other the cooperation between the Western Balkan states and China over the past decade, and especially during the second half of it, since 2015, 2016. But these words are also the campaign slogan of the ruling party in Serbia in 2017. As Alexandra just mentioned, President Alexander Vučić especially has been a very strong supporter of China, calling them our brothers, our saviors. And really during this election campaign, the cooperation with China was hailed as a strong suit, basically highlighting the economic development that this partnership is going to bring to the Serbian people. And therefore, it served also as one of the arguments that the Serbian ruling party used to convince the domestic population to keep voting for them, which tells you quite a lot about how important these ties are between China and Serbia, most of all among the Western Balkan countries. So stronger and faster, yes, we can say so, especially for Serbia, that the cooperation has been these two things. But has it also been better? Has it been beneficial for the Western Balkan states and their populations? The jury is still out on that question. And it is a question that I try to assess in my report, which aims to give an overview of this cooperation, focusing on three main areas: history, economy, and soft power. I will start with history. So surprisingly enough, for today's standards, Serbia was not at all the country of the Western Balkans with the closest links over the past century. This country was Albania. It is because of Enver Hoxha's communist regime pursued a very tight-knit relationship with Mao's China after their 1956 split with the Soviet Union. And to give you an idea how tight-knit this relation was, by 1966, 70% of Albanian trade was with the People's Republic of China. Afterwards, the relationship started deteriorating, coming to a complete standstill in 1978. And it is only actually after that date, and during the 1980s especially, that the Yugoslav states started to develop any relation at all with China. Because during the earlier years, relations were lukewarm at best, and actually some define them as mortal enemies, because of course, as it is well known, the Tito-Stalin split in 1948 ensued also a very confrontational type of relationship also with China. After the breakup of the Yugoslav Federation in the early 1990s, this is when Serbia became China's main political ally in Europe. And this new relationship was crowned by Slobodan Milosevic's visit to Beijing in 1997. And one of the most significant aspects of this entente was the fact that China abstained in voting on the UN Security Council Resolution 1244, which is the one that laid the groundwork for Kosovo's international recognition. So to this date, China has not yet formally recognized Kosovo, maintaining only informal relations. Today, of course, there is the 17+1 initiative, which Dimitar has already set out in detail. But the important thing that I would highlight here is that although China has this regional approach to the wider Southeastern European or Central and East European region, it also leaves space for bilateral relationship at state-to-state level and really working with the political elites in each state. Now, moving on to economy. The economy really has been front and center in the way that China dealt with Western Balkan states until very recently. And this narrative of mutual benefit for China and the Western Balkans was the one that was highlighting the most. It is important to highlight that what drives this engagement with China are also very tangible needs from the part of the Western Balkan states that very often have difficulties to get access to funding for infrastructure projects and in general FDI. But also, as other researchers have found, there is this desire for a strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the West, and also partially as an effect of homegrown dissatisfaction with the West, given that EU enlargement has slowed down and it has encountered many issues, as we know. So much has been said about the controversies of this economic relationship, so I will not dwell on that now, we can come back to them later. But just to mention some of them, there is of course the much discussed issue of the debt trap or financial sustainability issues. As we know, there is the absolutely crucial issue of non-transparency, that these deals are done at top level, and very often the details are not known to the populations. There is the issue of security and surveillance, once again, especially in Serbia. And there is the environmental damage, which is a topic that has been rightly gaining quite a lot of traction. Now on to soft power. There has been an increasing cooperation among think tanks already for quite some time. So China has really strived to get to know Central and Eastern Europe better in a very different way from what has happened in previous decades. And this also includes collaboration within academia that is increasing. So as happens in other parts of the world, China is starting to also engage by setting up campuses abroad. There is one in Montenegro. But let's remember that this is also something that is happening elsewhere and in Europe as well. As we know, Hungary has welcomed the first Chinese campus recently. And there are also Confucius institutes, one in every country, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina there are two, one for each entity. Now all this of course has been marred by controversy, and there is also the conspicuous issue of the funding for education, which is something that is being discussed, and once again very rightly also in connection with Western universities and how Western universities are getting access to more and more private funding, including from authoritarian states. But aside from think tanks and academia, there has been a push also in the media. And we have seen that very clearly during the coronavirus crisis. We had mask diplomacy at the beginning in spring 2020, followed by vaccine diplomacy lately. So this really shows that China is not going to limit itself to the economic cooperation in the region, but also that it is moving towards a more assertive, more present PR type of push. So to conclude, I would like to make a few remarks, a few wider remarks about the China and China-EU cooperation. So in this presentation and in this report and in general, I always do focus on the region that is of my expertise, which is the Balkans. However, I do think that it is important to bring in the Chinese perspective as well and have a few points of reference in mind when addressing China. And I think that there are quite a few misconceptions today in the Western discourse on China. And key among them is the fact that we often think about China in a monolithic way, whereas the Communist Party in China has really quite different opinions within it. And also we need to keep in mind that despite Xi Jinping's drive to centralize the whole Belt and Road Initiative and in general everything that happens in the country, China is really very vast and complex. There are so many actors involved. There are state-owned enterprises, there are private companies, ministries, provincial governments who are also very powerful, and they often compete with each other. And often initiatives such as the BRI, they offer a loose framework from the top to which lower level actors give content. So I really do think that we need to do a better job at understanding the complexities of what China represents. Now, the EU's reaction. The way that the EU is dealing with China at the moment can be encapsulated in the phrase principled pragmatism. Meaning that there are some principles that the EU, of course, abides by, but generally the tagline seems to be more realism and less ideology. In my view, there is a fallacy in this approach, because for certain issues, it is just impossible to decouple the two. So, for instance, academic ties can be beneficial only if academic freedom is respected. At the same time, economic development does not work without the rule of law. It can work in the short run, maybe, sometimes also doctoring the data, which sometimes happens in the Western Balkan countries especially, but it cannot work in the long run. Because it will not benefit the whole population. And eventually, if these countries are going to join the European Union, you will have, once again, issues of rule of law or of populism and of these type of authoritarian approaches. So to conclude, conclude, engaging with China is unavoidable today. It is the first or the second world economic power, depending on how you measure it. And it is also important to understand it in its many faces. So yes, criticize it, but without offering blanket criticism. But also at the same time, it is important to draw clear lines of what cannot be accepted from the EU side in terms of human rights, in terms of rule of law, and in terms of protection to the environment, among else. And in my view, in this way, Europe will also offer a better narrative, because this is where we're lagging behind if we compare ourselves to China. Europe is mired in so many crises, whereas China is galloping forward. It's this sort of positive force looking with optimism at the future. And I do really believe very strongly that Europe will be more inspirational if it sticks to its own values and if it makes sure that any type of relationship with other actors happens in the same framework. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tena. Thank you to all for your findings and framing the conversation. We already have a lot going on in the chat, but also in the Q&A. So I will skip my questions and go directly to you and to answer as many of those. So we'll do one by one, or I will try to frame them and assign to you, and then we'll go for a second round. So for you, Dimitar, from Sorin Ioniță from Romania, is there a list of BRI projects in Bulgaria which actually exist in reality, not just on paper? To all of the speakers, briefly, if there is a difference between China's approach in the Black Sea region compared to the Balkans. This is Jordan Bojilov from Sofia Security Forum. From Tiago Ferreira Lopez to Marcin, can we argue that China and Russia are in a negative alliance, since the main goal seems to be to reduce the power and presence of the US and EU? Is Central Asia a potential point of contention between the two powers? And to Tena, political ties between Albania and China took root in Mao's regime. So it was actually Albania that backed the resolution. I think it's just a comment, actually, in 1971. And then what misperception of China should the EU address ASAP? So maybe we start again with you, Dimitar. Let's keep to 2 minutes each, the intervention as answers to this, so we have time for another round.
Thanks, great. First question, is there a list of BRI projects in Bulgaria, and are they actually happening in reality, not only on paper? This is a fantastic question. I'm Bulgarian myself, and you have no idea how much effort it took me to actually find even Bulgarian news or reports on what's happening in the country under the BRI. You find a crazy PR initiative by China to invest in media hype in PR. There's headlines, there's promises for billions. But actually, if you dig in the data, you'll see that between 2012 and 2019, Chinese investment in Bulgaria is around 100 million euros, which is nothing compared with the ambitions. Actual projects in Bulgaria, I'll give two examples. One is the promise right after the 17+1 summit in Sofia in 2018. China signaled its interest to be a player and take part in the nuclear Belene power plant project on the Danube River. It remains unclear if the China National Nuclear Corporation is actually going to be a partner in this ambitious project, but this is clearly an attempt to boost the energy portfolio of China in Bulgaria. Second example, which is linked with the maritime corridor, maritime arm of the Belt and Road Initiative, is that in 2019, China signaled its intent to extend the BRI to Varna and the Black Sea port there, making sure that the port has boosted capabilities, and also the shipping facilities can facilitate improved access of Chinese products in European markets. So basically, China is investing in boosting the capacity of the port so it can trade with Europe. And another very quick example, 2013-2015, Bulgaria was supposed to be the hub for the production of automobiles with Chinese design. And there was a joint venture between Great Wall Motors, a Chinese company, and a Bulgarian company, which filed for bankruptcy in 2017. So this endeavor was not very successful. Very briefly on the second question, do you see a difference in China's approaches to the Black Sea region and the Balkans? Jordan Bozilov. Thank you for the question. I think Tena is an expert on this one, but my impressions, absolutely there's a different approach. I think more than half or around the half of the Belt and Road money in terms of projects and investment were aimed in the 5 Balkan countries. And the rest of 40–50% went to the other 12 countries under the 17+1 initiative. We see a clear interest of China to engage and invest more in the Balkans compared with the whole Central and Eastern European region. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Dimitar. Let's go to you, Marcin, on the question of a negative alliance, and then, yeah, we'll then move to Tena.
Thank you, Tiago, for this question. I guess we might call Russia and China being in a negative alliance, but once again with qualifications, because from the perspective, if we were to see the alliance between the two, it would be rather natural for both sides to support their most aggressive moves that are directed against the US and the EU as well, like in the case of Russia, policy towards Ukraine or other neighbors. In the case of China, the policy towards East and South China Sea. So I would say that both states approach the US in different manners, and China still has much more at stake in a certain degree of stability, in closer relations with the US, despite all the competition that we have seen. Whereas in the case of Russia, apart from the international security and nuclear arms control dimension, the relationship with the US is negative in general. So it is rather both states have different approaches to both the US, but also towards the EU. And whereas Russia sees much more competition with the EU, particularly in normative terms, in the case of China, the EU is on the one hand a challenge, but on the other, sometimes a useful partner, also to divide the West, like we have seen with the recent agreement on investment between China and the EU. And regarding the Central Asia as a potential point for competition, we have seen it for the last two and a half decades that Russia and China were said to be potential competitors in Central Asia, and we certainly saw episodes of competition, like with regard to Turkmenistan in 2009, or the very creation of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, both states' elites appear to realize that there is a threat of competition, and they are actively trying to avoid it, like with the so-called synchronization of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, which in practice means that China, as I would read it, Chinese leaders agree to pretend that Russia remains an equal partner in Central Asia or in Eurasia in general. So I would say that on the basis of what we have seen so far, Moscow and Beijing are quite skillful in avoiding this competition, for which there is certain potential. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marcin. Before I go to you, Tena, just 2 comments to Ian Anthony from CIPRI. The question on Turkey, we will not take it now because Selçuk, the author, is not present. So I think that we will pass that one, but it's in the report. And thank you for sharing the database for tracking the energy projects. It would be great to move just from energy to actually all maritime, rail, and so on. We'll see what we can do about it. So Tena, to you on the difference maybe between China in the Black Sea versus China in the Balkans, but also the biggest misperception of China that the EU should address ASAP. You already mentioned about the engagement that being unavoidable and so on, but what else should the EU leaders, decision makers take into account moving forward?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So about the misconceptions, the key one in relation to the policy on the Western Balkans is this a tendency to think about China-Western Balkans relations as China doing bad things in the Balkans, just as earlier on we had Russia doing bad things in the Balkans. So this discourse of malign influence. And now, more and more, luckily, there has been a shift in the discourse because it is very important to highlight that these negative effects, because there are many times negative effects, are more a result of a demand side rather than a supply side issue. In other words, it is important to recognize that it is the domestic political leaders and generally the situation on the ground, the lack of rule of law on the ground, that is the one that allows for Chinese malign influence to come in. Other misconceptions. So from taking it from the Chinese perspective. So very often we, in the West, we look at what is happening right now as the rise of China. But it is quite useful to remember that for China itself, this is more a comeback or a national nation, as Xi Jinping calls it. So before 1831, before the first Opium War, China was worth over 20% of the world GDP. So you understand that for them, it is quite a different perspective than the one we're having now. But key is the misconception that I mentioned before, which is the one that China is a monolithic actor. This is not so, and I do think we can and must do a better job at understanding the varieties within it, and crack down. I mean, really criticize those areas that do not work well, and try to engage more with actors that might not fall within the state of China, but that might be very well conducive to a good and transparent and beneficial cooperation between the two. So on the differences between the China's engagement in the Balkans and the wider Black Sea region, I would highlight here something that I mentioned also earlier, that China is very good at actually adapting its action on a bilateral level. So although we have the 17+1 initiative, the relations between China and individual states are styled according to what they find. So for instance, in Serbia, they have found a very, very secure, very solid partner, and China has made it their hub in the region, and they have one set of practices. However, if you look at China's main investment in, if we can call it so, investment in Croatia, the construction of the Pelješac bridge, this was an EU tender to which China responded, and they made a good offer, and they got the contract, they got the tender. So you see that there are two completely different sets of practices according to what is the situation on the ground. I hope I addressed the questions.
Thanks a lot, Tena. We have a commentary very important from Ambassador Doru Kostea. He was former ambassador of Romania to Beijing, among others. He says, and I think it's a very important point moving forward, when BRI was launched in 2013, the official messaging was that it aimed at China's rebalancing its own domestic development. It is a shapeshifter, so it shall be influenced quite heavily by how the Chinese economy itself fares. We could notice that the Chinese outgoing financial flows had been put under close scrutiny as of 2018 already, and the dual circulation concept to be implemented in the recently adopted 14th five-year plan might play a role as well in greater selectivity when picking next projects. Moreover, one might expect more demanding Chinese attitudes in future talks with existing and or potential partners. So that will definitely heavily influence how and what projects within the BRI will come to completion, if any. We do have about 6 more minutes, and I do want to go through another round of questions we have from Matthew Kennedy. So I will ask you to keep it to 1 minute each. For Marcin, how do you see the 17+1 mechanism as a factor in the Sino-Russian relations? For Dimitar, do you see China's Black Sea ports as being dual military commercial in nature, or they are purely for economic purposes? And then for Tena, is Russia different to China's strategic activities in the Balkans, or does Moscow see it as a threat to its regional interests? All very, very crucial questions. So I'll start the other way around with you, Tena, this time.
Oh, wow, great. This is a really interesting question. I was just wondering about it because really Russia and China, they don't, although they're very often put in the same basket in terms of their influence in the Western Balkans, but there are not many overlaps in terms of their action. I mean, you can't see them cooperating anywhere really. There is a partial overlap in the energy projects, because energy is definitely the economic sector in which Russia is most present in the Balkans, and China is active in this sector as well, especially in the heavy manufacturing industry. But what I would say in terms of the different approaches is that China's has been much more focused on the economy, at least so far. As we've seen, this might be changing a little bit, whereas Russia's influence, Russia's action has been also quite political, using this varied spectrum of actions and of actors that Russia uses in the Balkans to be a spoiler, basically, and to get to a point in which it distorts in a way or the other the opportunities for the Western Balkans to integrate with the West.
Thank you. Dimitar, dual use, economic and military?
Yeah, great question by Matthew. I guess it's prompted by China's dual use, more or less strategy in other parts of the world. Maybe Matthew's thinking about the Indian Ocean, the ports around the Indian Ocean, or maybe China's base in Djibouti. But in the Black Sea region, in this case, I would say no. This, especially in the port of Varna in Bulgaria, also the Chinese endeavors in Georgia, in the city of Anaklia, they attempted to expand the port there as well, I think unsuccessfully. These efforts, I don't see them as with military intent or dual use intent. This is used as a gateway to European markets and to make sure that Chinese shipments grow in volume and have better access to Europe. And very quickly, because I really like the question of the misperceptions of China, which the EU should address. Many things can be said about trade, about human rights, but I would take it from another angle. When it comes to digital, I think that the EU should finally understand that when it comes to digital infrastructure, digital penetration, the problems are not about privacy or about competition per se. These questions are turning into national security concerns, because heavily subsidized Chinese digital companies, really heavily subsidized, which are bred with data and public money, they are accessing our markets. Questions of espionage, not only privacy, exporting AR surveillance across the world and also in our own backyard. So I think the EU should really reconsider its position when it comes to allowing Chinese tech. And why should we wait for America to push us on banning malicious software or hardware? We need to pick up our game on this front ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dimitar. Marcin, is 17+1 playing at all into the China-Russia relationship?
Thank you for this question. Very briefly, I would say no, it's not. On the surface, it looks as if China managed to achieve the goal which eluded Russia for the last 30 years, so to organize former communist bloc states within one format. But as Dimitar mentioned a lot about 17+1, it is quite often disappointment for its participants. From the China-Russian perspective, I would say that Beijing seems to take into consideration Russian red lines, and even it might be natural to include Belarus or Ukraine in 17+1. Nobody is proposing it, and the idea is to put Belarus as an observer where we're stopped by China. So I would say that China keeps 17+1 and as its instrument in relations with both the region states and the European Union, but it's not aimed at Russia.
Thanks a lot, Marcin. There are many, many questions that I also had prepared, but they will be left unanswered, or I encourage everyone to go through the report. I added the link. It's already uploaded on the GLOBSEC website. It will also be available on Martens Center website and on Black Sea Trust. Again, I would like to thank everyone very much for the contribution and for your participation today. Also to all 5 authors of the report, and of course to our partners, Wilfried Martens Center and the Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation of the German Marshall Fund Bucharest office, who are also kind enough to co-fund as well this report. With that being said, I think that we have still a lot of homework to do, both at home, but also when it comes to the understanding of Chinese foreign security and economic interests in our neighborhood, in our areas of strategic interest for the EU or for the transatlantic relationship. So I hope this is just one of the first steps that we take forward in actually enabling a more broader and in-depth conversation about how China in the broader Black Sea region actually plays a role and influences the decision-making both in Brussels, but also in Washington, D.C. With that being said, again, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. I hope that you find the report very useful and informative, and we'll keep you posted with other GLOBSEC related events in the near future. Have a very, very good afternoon, everyone.